This is entitled Journey to Freedom, the African American Presence in Methodism. I am your facilitator. Keep that in mind. I is not a doctor. I am your facilitator. I'm just guiding us through this process. In 2003, the Women's Division of the General Board of Global Ministries, United Methodist Church, published a book entitled Exodus, The Journey to Freedom, Study Guide to Exodus, Journey to Freedom, by Christine and Bernard Keels. This spiritual growth study was based on the Old Testament book of Exodus. The Keels provided us with a deep river of content to draw us through a historical journey of African American Methodists in the United States. Also, Bishop Forrest Stitt, who retired in July 2019, wrote a paper for the African American Heritage Center entitled Lessons of the Black Church in Methodism. In this paper, which I think you may have received a copy of it, with a timeline and some suggested readings and articles. In this paper, a timeline of African American presence in Methodism was developed using John Graham's book, Black Methodist Retrospect and Prospect, which was printed by Vantage Press in 1979. It's available through the African American Heritage Center. From these two sources, our series is named and developed in their honor for the diligence, commitment, sacrifice, and efforts of all three of them to bring this story out from the shadows of the devalued, disregarded contributions and participation of African American Methodist people. We are most grateful and thankful for their courage and witness. So we want to acknowledge how we came up with the name. It's not our name, we stole it from three people. That's the outlaw. In memory, we dedicate this series to the memory of Stephen F. Neal, who served for over 40 years as an Alabama West Florida minister, including 18 years as senior pastor at Dolphin Way, as well as years as pastor emeritus. In the words of Fry Gilliam, Alabama minister never lost himself in the battle. That's an article that's just recently come out through United Methodist News Service. In an email to me on April 25th, 2021 at 8:04 p.m., Steve wrote these words. Dear Frederick, cannot thank you enough for sharing yourself with us in the discussion tonight. It was authentic, relevant, and I'm sure we'll have meaningful results at Dolphin Way. I was delighted to hear you mention Dan Jones and Curtis Coleman. They were both good friends before they went to Athens College, where I graduated. It would be such a blessing to have you teach a course on something like the history and meaning of Methodism, or Methodism, a design for the future. I will long remember and reflect on Caucasian arrogance, paternalistic condescension, and ethical expediency. With more delight and with equal urgency, I will always remember how we wish to clean the fish before we catch them. But God sends us to catch them first. So that's the impetus of how this series was born. Steve Deal, and we want to let you know we're doing this in his memory. Methodists have experienced historic divisions because of slavery and racism from which we have yet to recover. This four-part series on Journey to Freedom, African American Methodist presence in African American presence in Methodist Church or United Methodist Church is about a journey the Methodist family has been on since John Wesley began his ministry. Slave trading of Africans was already in full swing, and Wesley would have none of the execrable villainy which is the scandal of religion. There are lessons from our Methodist history of sojourn which may provide us with a roadmap and a way forward during this biblical and historic moment. Part 1, 1730 to 1840. John Wesley, in development of Methodist societies, denouncing slavery, Methodist societies come to America in the first General Conference. Some Africans break away from the church after the St. George segregation and the beginning of the Underground Railroad. We'll see how far we get with that today. John Wesley was the founder of Methodism. He was born in 1703 in Epworth, England, into a family well acquainted with workings of the Anglican Church. He was strongly influenced by a popular doctrine calling for the strictly monitored use of time. Wesley applied this approach to his religious life by devoting more attention to refining the inner life as a way of monitoring external events and appetite. I think you need to chew on that for a while. He applied this approach to his religious life by devoting more attention to refining the inner life as a way of monitoring external events and appetites. Upon returning from England, this questioning, combined with the advice of some who claimed salvation by faith alone, resulted in Wesley's conversion experience in 1738, known as the Aldersgate Street experience, where his heart was strangely warmed. Wesley developed a renewed interest in evangelism through traveling ministry, preaching in a variety of venues marked the remainder of Wesley's life. During the early years as a traveling minister, Wesley worked out a system of societies and ritual materials intended to buttress, expand the Anglican Church. Activities included love feast services and watch night services. I found this to be interesting. Love feast and watch night services. A love feast was a gathering in which members of society were free to speak about their religious struggles and victories. A watch night took place on a given Friday and involved prayer, singing, and preaching, which began late in the evening and lasted till midnight. Did y'all get that? Now, the love feast is what we call now Bible study. Notice the difference. In the love feast, the members spoke freely about their religious struggle. You know, that's what goes on in Bible study. I'm sorry, that's supposed to be a joke, y'all. And watch night was not waiting from one year to end or another begin, but you started somewhere around after you ate, about 6 in the afternoon, and you preached, or that was preaching until midnight. That's a real watch night service. On November 29, 1958, John Wesley baptized his first African convert into a society. It was at Wadsworth, England, a metropolitan borough of London, that black people of African descent, became historically related to the Methodist movement. Religious societies were groups who sought through combined efforts to promote and encourage a warmer religious life. The earliest societies were formed by a group of young men in London around 1678 for prayer, reading of scripture, the cultivation of a religious life, frequent communion, aid to the poor, soldiers, sailors, and prisoners, and encouragement of preaching. If you look at that part, what they were doing: prayer, reading of scripture, cultivation of religious life, frequent communion, aid to the poor, soldiers, sailors, and prisoners, encouragement of preaching. You will find that very thing addressed in Acts, the 2nd chapter, around verse 42, when it says, when the apostles gathered people, said, and all who believed were together, and they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, the breaking of prayers, fellowship, and the breaking of bread. And they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, prayers, fellowship, and the breaking of bread. Those 4 things, I'm convinced, are what grows the church, what starts a church, what revives a church, what can restore a church. I was in a conversation this past week about new church starts, and the individual basically challenged those of us with the board of congregational development, said, well, you all never started a new church, so you don't know what I'm going through. And I had to, I understand he was young, and had not had come through the struggles that my wife and I have come through as a clergy couple. But I shared with him, I said, regardless of whether you're starting a new church, revitalizing a church, rebuilding a church, it's the same 4 things you have to do. You have to go back to Acts 2nd chapter, verse 42, 44, and they devoted themselves, 1, to apostles' teaching, 2, fellowship, 3, breaking of bread, 4, prayers. That's the church. And as you can see, that's what the religious societies of the 17th century in the Anglican Church gathered themselves around. Even though the society movement declined after 1710 in England, the societies were to continue and be of importance in the beginning of Methodism. Methodism was late in reaching America, not until 1766 did work begin. The style of worship and emotional energy which characterized Methodist society worship was foreign to most Anglicans. The emotional nature of these meetings, as well as its theological emphasis on conversion and relationship with God, marked the evangelical thrust of society. Notice that the style of worship and emotional energy which characterized worship in a Methodist society was foreign to most Anglicans. You think about it. Methodist society, so-called because of their fixed structure and systematic approach to the Christian life, did not base membership on strict regulations and doctrinal commitments. Membership was not based on strict relationships and doctrinal commitments. Those seeking fellowship needed only to present themselves as sincere seekers of righteousness, saved by faith alone, with the ability to answer properly questions related to their salvation. This conversion experience involved a faith-based acceptance of God's grace, which was a clear move away from Calvinistic notions of predestination. Did not base membership on strict regulations and doctrinal commitments. Think about that again. It's just a matter of, do you accept the Lord Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior? The centralization of these societies was important to the success of Methodism. The activities of each society were centralized to monitor growth and to address problems. Interesting. Which brings us to the difference between a connectional system and one that's congregational. The centralization of activities of each society to monitor growth and to address problems. Regional meetings took place throughout the calendar year, which brought individual societies together. Wesley began calling a larger meeting the conference, which brought together traveling ministers from various regional meetings to report on their spiritual and financial efforts. Does that sound familiar? The conference, first held in 1784, became the governing body of the Methodist Society. The Christmas Conference of 1784 occurred, we'll come speak more to that later on, about 3 or 4 day period, became the governing body of the Methodist Church. 1784, the birth of the Methodist Church. Even with this structure in place, Wesley maintained control over the societies until his death. However, there was a problem with Wesley doing this of the societies in America and what was going on in England. Friction existed between Methodist societies and the Anglican Church. By Anglican Church, we mean churchmen at this point. The organizational structure of the Methodist societies, traveling ministers appointed by Wesley, did not fit with the hierarchy of the Anglican Church. The style of worship, stay with me on this, the style of worship and loosely defined requirements for membership and ministry made the societies more attractive, as well as resulted in higher worship attendance than the Anglican communion. I think you might need to stay with that one for a while. The style of worship and loosely defined requirements for membership and ministry made the societies more attractive, as well as resulted in higher worship attendance than the Anglican community. There's a debate that's going on now within our denomination of what's more important, church membership or average worship attendance? Church membership or AWA? And for many years, you know, people, and I must admit, I may have been one of those, particularly when it comes to the end of year report, the pastor would, I'm about to make a confession, I would think. Let us say the end of the year report, there would be some adjustments made in the membership so that it would not increase your portion. That's where I'm going with that. Okay. Some pastors made adjustments. All right. I tell the God I was not one. That's my left hand. But anyhow, notice that, so the issue now is that a lot of churches, they will talk about average worship attendance because to be a member, there's another set of requirements that one has to meet. So is it membership or is it average worship temple? Just some of the two. But this was the friction that was developing between Wesley, being an Anglican priest, appointing ministers, lay, and eventually clergy to societies in England and then into America, but he's still an Anglican priest. You can see the friction that's developed. John Wesley wanted to maintain links with the Anglican Church, yet the break in 1781 was inevitable. Wesley provided the final impetus by appointing 3 superintendents responsible for growing Methodist societies in North America at the Christmas Conference of 1784. Wesley assumed the authority, stay with me on this one, Wesley assumed the authority held by Anglican bishops to appoint and ordain ministers. These appointments were necessary to continue the effective ministry done by Methodist evangelists. In the newly independent United States of America, the Anglican Church no longer filled this function. Part of the reason they didn't fill this function is because the Church of England, the crown head of England, is head of the Church of England. And America is going through a period of separating, no longer becoming a British colony, but becoming a separate entity. So if you're a member of the Anglican Church, that means your loyalty is to the crown head, the monarch of England. So that's part of what caused this creation of the Christmas Conference, so that this would be a separate entity from the Church of England. You may want to come back to that in a question. Wesley would not allow the savings of souls to be lost. He would not allow the saving of souls to be lost, because if it stayed as a part of the Anglican Church, that possibly would create that fracture and that separation. So he was more concerned with saving souls than showing allegiance to the Church of England. In 1769, Wesley sent the first of 8 officially appointed lay missionaries, the only one of which to remain active in American Methodism during an African-American Revolution was Francis Asbury. He sent 8, but the only one to remain active. Keep in mind, the American Revolution is going on, and then during and after, the only one to stay active was Francis Asbury. During the 1770s, Methodism mushroomed chiefly in Maryland and Virginia as a society loosely tied to the Church of England. The ministry of Francis Asbury provided a major North American Methodist thrust. The growth of Methodism in America is due large part to the zeal of ministers and laypersons, exemplified and inspired by Asbury, who traveled trade routes to the southeast, northwest, and west, and who battled theological oppositions from those in New England. These preachers used the circuit system to spread Methodism. Now, nowadays, when I came along, probably before, and Charles Farrell came along back in the 40s as a preacher, you would start on a circuit, and that circuit would be either near the Georgia line, so you could attend seminary. You have 3 churches. You go to the churches on the weekend, and you be in seminary during the week. But seminaries then, classes would start on Tuesday, go to Friday afternoon, and you go back to church. So you would start out in the country where you had a trailer with a septic tank and field lines. And you had to preach your way back to the city. Now, seriously, that's the thing. Yeah, my wife's right over there, give me a trailer, septic tank, field line, and 3 cinder blocks with our steps into the prayer. We're just glad to get an appointment. Now, when preachers carry from seminary, the first question they ask, what's the package? I'm not throwing rocks at nobody. But the circuit system was how Methodism did. Robert Strawbridge, a layperson, formed the first American society near Sam's Creek in the northern part of Maryland in 1764. An African slave named Ann Schweitzer is believed to have been a charter member of that first society in 1764. A slave woman called Betty was one of the 5 persons present when the John Street Society was organized by Philip Emory in Philip Emory's home in New York 2 years later. So you have an African, because that's what the term that was used in, African slave or African black. African joined the first society in 1764. Then another African slave joined the society, or free African, joined the society in 1766 in New York City. And then you have the names of Margaret, Rachel, and several other African servants appeared among the list of contributors to the fund for building the first meeting house in New York. So all of this is happening. John Wesley brought an African person into the first circle in Wadsworth, England, 1759. Now we see the first African, that was in England. Now in America, 1764, 1766, you see the Brothers of African Blacks in Methodist Society in the New World. The story of American Methodism beginnings has to do with the significant contributions of African American preachers. As Harry B. Richardson has observed, we do not know the names of many of these early Negro preachers, to say nothing of the story of their lives. The first Negro preacher to establish a wide reputation in Methodism was Harry Hoosier. He was born a slave in North Carolina around 1750. Hoosier was converted under the preaching of the eminent bishop, Francis Asbury. And he was believed, it is believed he was unable to read and write. He became a circuit riding preacher with a reputation almost as great as that of the bishop. There's a story that goes that Harry Hoosier preached, and he was so eloquent in his preaching, the people asked, he said, "Oh, that's the bishop preaching?" They said, "No, that's the bishop's servant." He said, "If that's the bishop's servant, what kind of bishop do we have?" If that was his servant. In other words, he would out-preach Bishop Francis Asbury. The New York Packet, which I think eventually became the Wall Street Journal or New York Times, referred to Hoosier as one of the most gifted preachers in the world. He traveled with Freeborn Garrison, Thomas Cope, Francis Asbury, Richard Watco, Jesse Lee, and other appointees of John Wesley. Harry Hoosier and Richard Allen are among the group of preachers and missionaries who conducted American Methodist work up to as well as being present at the Christmas Conference of 1784, the beginning of the Methodist Church in America. The most memorable tribute to Hoosier, who died in 1806, was paid by Bishop Thomas Cope, who insisted that any story of the beginning of Methodism in America which does not give a prominent place to Harry Hoosier, familiarly called Black Harry, is inadequate. Surely he deserves a place in Methodism's Hall of Fame. Other Negro preachers who were active in the early Methodist movement were Richard Allen. I think when the announcement went out was James Allen, but that's an honest mistake. Richard Allen, Daniel Coker, Henry Evans, Absalom Jones, Christopher Rush, Abraham Thompson, and James Barrett. All of these were preachers in the early movement of African descent, early movement circuit riders, along with Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury, developing societies and churches along the eastern seaboard and throughout parts of the South. These men shared with John Wesley's appointed preachers a concept of ministry and missionary urgency and compassion that was rooted in the evangelical revival in England and the Great Awakening in colonial America. They traveled on circuits, preached at Methodist meetings, and provided spiritual leadership for their people. The most notable was Richard Allen, a Delaware ex-slave who traveled with Richard Watco, Peter Morat, and Ivory Ellis on various circuits in Delaware, Maryland, and New Jersey. When segregated practices became increasingly evident in the Methodist Episcopal Church in the late 1780s and 1790s, Richard Allen, Daniel Coker, Christopher Rush, and Abraham Thompson, and James Barrett withdrew and became pioneers in the independent African Methodist movement. Absalom Jones broke away and became the first African Episcopal priest in America. Henry Evans was the only one in the group to remain within the predominantly white Methodist church. The St. George's Church segregation. In the North, it became the practice to seat Negroes in special sections, sometimes in the balcony, if there was one, or on the side or in the back of the church. This was especially the case where the Negro membership was large and growing. Oftentimes, if you look at that reading list, some of those books I will share with you, you will find that oftentimes in these churches, the Negro, African, or black population worshiping outnumbered the white. To the Negroes in the North, especially to the free Negroes in the North, this practice of segregation in worship was disappointing and offensive. It seemed to them that the Church of Jesus Christ, to whom all Christians, white and black, look for their salvation, was the one place where Christians should meet as brothers and sisters, and discrimination should not obtain or be present. This feeling of resentment against distinctions in worship shows perhaps better than anything else how Christian faith kept alive in the slave and in the black freedman the sense of his inherent dignity and equality as a person and a child of God. It helped to show the wrong of slavery as a defiance of the will of God. Segregation, even though they were one, even though they were brought in, even though they were considered part of the whole, they were separated in the worship service. Even to the point that if blacks were sitting in the wrong place, they would be asked to either go to the back, to the outside, or the balcony if one existed. The resentment of Negroes against segregation worship and other activities of Methodism is almost given classic expression by Richard Allen, who at the time was a member of St. George's Church in Philadelphia, who later becomes the first active bishop of the AME Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church. In 1787, one Sunday morning, a scuffle arose during the worship service when an overzealous sexton attempted to force Allen and two other Negro members to sit in a special section of the balcony of the church. They withdrew and held meetings in a storeroom. Later, they built a separate house of worship. Now, this is where this story has various versions, because the argument goes that Richard Allen was similar to Harry Hoosier, that he couldn't read or write. He was unintelligent and his brain was not fully developed. So they say that Allen and others, Absalom Jones and Varick and others, they didn't understand what the section was telling them. They thought the section was telling them to go down front, and it really telling them to go upstairs. But then there's another version based on whose history you're reading, which book you're reading, is that this was an intentional act by Allen, Varick, and Absalom Jones to not be denied their place within this church, because they all accepted it. If there is a God and if we believe in Jesus Christ, all of us, we are brothers and sisters, and our color of our skin does not make a difference. So you have two different schools of thought on it. So as they go down to pray, they are snatched off their knees and told to, and according to whose book you're reading, the language is used different. And they decide, they make a conscious decision then that since we cannot be a part of the church, we'll separate and create our own society. This is at St. George's Church in 1787. Segregated practices such as these led some Negroes, African blacks, to seek their own worship services where they not only could worship without the humiliations imposed by whites, but where they could have services suited to their needs, express their hopes and hurts, their sorrows and aspirations, as well as their undying hope for freedom. We read a statement earlier about Wesley talking about the execrable villainy of scandal religion. Wesley has written several documents, pamphlets on slavery, but one that comes out through history is his letter to William Wilberforce, who was a member of the English Parliament. And this is the letter that he wrote to William Wilberforce, which there's an HBCU named after him, Wilberforce University in Wilberforce, Ohio. This letter was written by Wesley to William Wilberforce, February 24, 1791. Dear sir, unless the divine power has raised us to be as Athanasius contra mundum, I see not how you can go through your glorious enterprise in opposing that execrable villainy which is the scandal of religion, of slavery, and of human nature. Unless God has raised you up for this very thing, you will be worn out by the opposition of men and devils. But if God be for you, who can be against you? Are all of them together stronger than God? Oh, be not weary of well-doing. Go on in the name of God and the power of his might. To even American slavery, the violence that ever saw the sun shall vanish away before it. Reading this morning a tract wrote by a poor African, I was particularly struck by that circumstance that a man who has a black skin being wronged or outraged by a white man can have no redress. It being a law in our colonies that the oath of a black against a white goes for nothing. What villainy is this? That he who has guided you from your youth up may continue to strengthen you in this and all things, is the prayer of this servant. Your affectionate servant, John Wesley. So that's where that phrase comes from, the execrable villainy, which is the scandal of religion. We may not use the word execrable, but just use the word wretched, the wretched villainy. So this is him writing with it. Wilberforce, for many of you know history, Wilberforce had a conversion experience, and he was the one that wrote the bill that became the law of the English Parliament that they abandoned slavery and abolished slavery before in England. All right. But we'll entertain some questions. We can get some light here. I think Michael had the first 3 questions.
I will start with some of my own.
Oh, before you start, let me introduce my wife so Jamie Blake won't damn me to hell. This is my wife, Amanda Albaugh, here with me. Yeah. We lost her brother this past week, so we'll be leaving sometime this week, more than that by Wednesday, heading to Birmingham for services. We come this summer, July, she would have been putting up with me for 50 years, and my wife knew me before I was a Methodist preacher. Just want to share that with you. All right?
Judge Sewell, you prefer to?
No, go ahead. Oh, okay, I got to clean mine up. I got all this stuff on it.
You don't have to use it.
No. Let's make it like a TV show. I like that. Good.
You know, at my advanced age, my knees just don't hold up.
That's probably where these old folks shoot. I got all these. This rubber sole stick to 1 inch thick. Go ahead.
One of the questions we had from the crowd was that when we had that separation, when the black preachers left the Methodist Episcopal Church because of that segregation, did the new churches that they opened have membership and equal access to all, or were they safe spaces for African worshipers?
I don't think there was anything that excluded others, but they were primarily African American. They were predominantly African American, I would say that. But they did not have any restrictions in their clauses or in their membership. Now, keep in mind, Richard Allen, James Barrett, and those separated and created a completely different denomination. But as they said, there's Zoar in Philadelphia, Sharp Street in Baltimore, and other places up north. And we're going to pick up with this when we come back next week. Those churches, they never left the Methodist Episcopal Church. They just accepted that we're not respected and regarded, so we'll just create our own space. But they were still under the supervision of whoever the bishop was at the time. Okay. Now, next week we'll talk about how those of us in the South, but this way it's a little tricky, those of us in the South, we became the missionary effort. Let's say Warren Street, which merged with Tobinville in '66 to form the Tobinville-Warren Street Parish because of the Central Alabama Conference still existed and Alabama West Water Conference still existed. So they could not be declared a church, so they were declared a parish because white pastors appointed by one conference and the black pastors appointed by the other. So they, Don Collins, I think, in his book, When the Church Bell Rang Races, he talks about that, is invisible murder. So let us say Warren Street may have been started somewhere in the 1800s, but it was started by the missionary efforts of whites coming into the South to maintain black Methodist Episcopal churches. That's why, and then we were separated in 1939. So there was never any exclusion. People were welcome, and next question.
I look forward, and I know I speak for all of us,
Yeah.
for the end of the story where you reveal how it is that the church is no longer so influenced by external politics. We've gotten past simply recreating the political divides of our nation.
And that's not.
That'd be nice.
You had 3 questions.
I did. Well, I had one. That was, so the big question I have as you're sharing all that is probably the big question that a lot of folks have, and it is a future one, about how did it go so wrong? There's possibility. You are naming possibilities that they're from the beginning, not the fullness.
Yeah. That's why I want to go back
Yeah.
so we can come forward, right?
So before we get to how did it go wrong, which I assume will be a big part of next week, one of the questions I'd love for you to share a little bit more on is, as best you can tell, there's probably no definitive answer, but how did it go right? You named a handful of things that were distinctively Methodist, the methodical nature of their work, the practice, the worship that had more room for emotional expression than the Anglican tradition, the use of lay preachers who may not have had the same formal training or licensing from a bishop that the Anglican priests would have had. Out of all those things, or maybe even something that didn't come up, what do you think was most responsible for that unique moment in Methodist history where it tended to bring people together who would not have rubbed shoulders if not for the Methodist movement, who it brought people into worship who otherwise might have worshipped in very different places or worshipped with very different traditions, might not even have worshipped in the same religion. What was it about the fire of that early Methodist movement that was so attractive to both white settlers and African slaves and allowed them to even occupy the same room, if imperfectly, if not in the way that we would have hoped?
Keep up.
Yeah, it at least began there, and I was curious which aspects of Methodism you thought were most essential to that early fire.
Well, there's several ways to come at that question. One is an expression that I picked up some years ago. I'm convinced the Holy Spirit dropped it on me. It says, what would you rather be? Would you rather be open, inclusive, and inviting? Open, inclusive, and inviting, or would you rather be closed, exclusive, and closed, exclusive, and can't think of that word. Open, inclusive, and inviting. Yeah. Open, exclusive, and elitist. Thank you. Open, closed, elitist, and exclusive. Open, inclusive, or inviting, or closed, elitist, and exclusive. That's interesting. I've got a boy, I put that up. You can be open or closed. You can be inviting or elitist, or you could be exclusive or inclusive. Isn't that something? But then there's these other 3 things. Methodism advanced 3 things that Americans found captivating. God's free grace, the liberty of people to accept or reject that grace, and the power and validity of popular religious expression, that is servants, women, and African Americans. God's free grace, the liberty of people to accept or reject that grace, and the power and validity of popular religious expressions coming from servants who could be slaves, or women, or the African Americans.
And if you have a question that occurs to you over the course of this week, well, bring it next week, and we want to make use of that and let them build. But there was one other question, actually there's several here, but I'm not going to hold everybody hostage to my questions. There is one other that seemed really important to me though. I appreciate you highlighting something that has always seemed essential to Methodism, which was that we began over, your phrase for it was, we refuse to allow souls to be lost.
Yes, that was the question.
I think that was
the choice he had to make.
I think that's essential to who we are. The Methodist denomination did begin because of a doctrinal dispute of saying, well, we think that it is this way or that way on some issue of predestination or the nature of God. We insisted we weren't saying anything new. We just, while everybody else was thinking of reasons not to go and minister in a place, we were trying to think of reasons to.
Yeah.
And trying to think of how to make it happen. And so the question I have for the Methodist Church, for the church I serve, for the church you serve, for all churches is, if we assume that's still God's desire, that no soul should be lost, what do you think God needs from Methodist churches today? If we are to live as if no soul should be lost.
I constantly go back to that part passage in Acts, when it says, once, after Pentecost, and they began to evangelize and meet in home, it said they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, fellowship, breaking bread and prayer. Devotion to the apostles' teaching, fellowship, breaking bread. Those are four things. And if you notice, when you go back to the religious societies and the early Methodist society, that's what they did. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching for us, but they did not have the New Testament as we have it in the first century after Pentecost. But we devote ourselves to the apostles' teaching, the scriptures that we know, whether it's the 67 books of the Old and New Testament, or it's the 7, 8 books of the Apocrypha included. We see that tradition from the call of Abram to go to a place that he knows not of, looking for the city, to when John's on the Isle of Patmos and he sees that city descending out the clouds from heaven unto God. So we cover that whole period, and we see that, and we accept that reality that God is the God of the universe, and God calls all people.
I think you have a habit of both answering the question and also answering questions some folks didn't know they needed to ask.
I say, I like to scratch people where they don't need it.
Frederick, I want to thank you for your time and all your protestations to the contrary. I think you made excellent use of the time. I trust you will next week, and hope that we can look forward to seeing you next week to join us again, to ask more questions, to look forward a little bit, to see ways in which it may, to ask some of those questions about where did it either go wrong or continue going wrong